So we're now recording, just so you know. We're very lucky to have Rich Fahey here for a talk this evening. This has been sponsored very willingly and gleefully by the English department, the religion department. I don't know if Jeff Marshall from Libraries agreed to co-sponsor, but I think he would have. Sean Field from History jumped on it very quickly. We're quite overjoyed to have this event. And it's particularly nice. This is the first sort of virtual event for a guest that I've had and organized, I'm happy to say. And so I thought what I could do is tell you just a bare bones about Rich. Rich just got his PhD in 2019 from Notre Dame. He worked on Beowulf and the role of Riddles, sort of behind the scenes, I think, in Beowulf, and pedagogical. He was basically working with texts that were in the schoolrooms that sort of inform his reading of Beowulf. And so what he's going to talk about today is these riddles in, I think, the Exeter manuscript. And is it Exeter?
Yeah, the Exeter book, and then also I'm talking about some Anglo-Latin riddles as well. So a little bit, mostly Old English, but with some Latin as well.
Okay, and he has some great publications to his name, and he's a budding young scholar. We're hoping to hear a lot more from him, and we're glad to be here close to the start, although he was at UVM as an undergrad, so he's a proud son of UVM. And we're happy to have him here. And with that, I think that's enough of an introduction. Just we'll hand it over to Rich.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacques. And let me share my screen now. So I hope everyone can now see my screen. All right. So thank you all for being here and joining my virtual workshop on medieval runes, riddles, and enigmas. I want to take just a minute to thank Professor Jacques Bailey and also the Classics, English, History, and Religion departments at University of Vermont for having me and for organizing this event. So what connects runes and riddles? Because my talk is about runes, riddles, and also enigmas, which are connected. And so what connects these things? What do I mean by enigma? These are some of the questions that we'll be answering. Runes appear with relative consistency in Old English riddles, as we will discuss. So there's one connection. However, the biggest underlying affinity is mystery. The mystery of reading runes. And in fact, the word rune itself in Old English means mystery, as well as letter staves, so as well as letters and characters. In referring to enigmas, I mean to discuss some of the Anglo-Latin enigmata, which Michael Lapidge famously translates as mysteries rather than riddles. So you can see the connection there as well. In addition to the vernacular counterparts, I will discuss these Latin riddles and also specifically the rhetorical strategies which are employed in both the Latin and Old English riddles. We're going to start with runes. So although the word rune means mystery in Old English and most of its Germanic language cognates, and despite magical and mystical connotations surrounding the modern word rune, Old English and Old Norse Icelandic runes are first and foremost letters, as they are used in this manuscript known as the Codex Runicus. Runes are the native Germanic script carved in wood and stone and developed shortly after Germanic tribes interacted with the Roman Empire. Oh, sorry. So runacy. This is just a quick touchstone. I just want to talk about this very briefly, but this concept of runacy, which was coined by Terje Spurkland, emphasizes that unlike the Latin alphabet, there is no standardization with regard to runes. And so their representations differ wildly as a result, and as is attested in both the archaeological and the manuscript evidence. For example, on this manuscript folio of St. John's manuscript 17, folio 5V. A table contains Futhark runes, Latin ciphers, and other cryptic alphabets. And the table reveals a number of different but related and nevertheless distinct runic alphabets. So one thing basically to keep in mind is that runes come in all shapes and sizes. They're not standardized, despite that modern reconstructions will usually do that. So rules for reading runes. However, the modern rune reading books and divination books, which are popular with the New Age, create this sense of uniformity within the runic system. And so now we have the Futhark alphabet, which is kind of a fixture, especially within modern fantasy literature. And whether we're reading modern Futhark runes or medieval runes, there are 4 major rules that will help one navigate and unlock the mystery of the letters. So we'll review them together. The first is the rule of Latin equivalency. So the Futhark runic alphabet is based on the Latin alphabet. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is the rule of linear engraving. So runes are characterized by straight lines, which could be engraved in wood or stone or other objects. And we have the rule of non-horizontality. So rules may be based on unexpected orientations of their Latin counterparts. And finally, the 4th rule is the rule of incompleteness or excess. Runes sometimes add or miss a stroke and use minimal or excessive information. So if we keep these things in mind, I will suggest that we can actually read most of the runes. So let's try this together. So, rule of Latin equivalency. Most of the Futhark runic alphabet is based on the Latin alphabet, as we've said. However, there are some Germanic-specific characters, especially the thorn and the win, and each, in these cases, receive their own unique runic letter that does not correspond, obviously, with any Latin equivalent. These characters are generally rounded in manuscript folia, as you can see there with the little manuscript images, and those ones are pulled from the Exeter book. Now, keeping in mind that most runes are, in fact, modeled on Latin, what letters do you think these particular runes correspond to? Someone who wants to guess with this one. What is this rune?
An F.
An F. Chris, thank you. And how about this one? Anyone?
An H.
An H. Very good. This one is quite transparent. Any guesses?
I.
Yes. Thanks, Jock. I know that one is tricky. Now we get a little tougher. Anyone have a sense of what this might be?
M, perhaps?
An M it is. And one more for right now. Any guesses? T. Very good. That is the T. All right. So there's the rule of Latin equivalency. Now we're on to the rule of linear engraving. So runes are, as I said, characterized by straight lines, which could be engraved in wood or stone or whalebone, in the case of the bottom image of some of the runes from the famous Frank's casket. The Latin equivalency in these examples that I have now in front of you are pretty readily apparent. These are some of the more directly related runic characters. Of course, there is notably they are more linear than their Latin counterparts than we generally expect because of that engraving. So now let's look at the rule of non-horizontality. So runes may be based on altered orientations of their Latin counterparts. When Latin letters, so what Latin letters might these runes correspond to? Remember, their orientations are unusual. So what about this rune? Any guesses?
Hmm.
J?
What is it?
A J?
Good idea. It is upside down.
A C or a U?
A U or a V.
Huh.
Very good. All right. Now, second one. What about this one?
Hmm.
C.
Good thinking, but no.
L.
L it is. And all right, and then we'll move on to one more. Now remember, we've already seen M, so this is not M.
Could that be a C?
It is not a C.
Oh.
It's not a sigma.
Nope. It's not upside down, it's on its side.
E?
Z, yeah.
E it is. Very good.
Wow.
Excellent. All right. And the final rule for reading runes, if you know Latin, of course, is the rule of incompleteness or excess. So sometimes runes will add or remove a stroke from their Latin exemplars, thereby providing minimal or superfluous information. So what letters might these runes correspond to? The first, this one is tricky. What if we add a stroke? What is that?
A backwards 4.
It absolutely is a backwards 4. I probably should have removed the first descender as well, but that one, a little tricky, is an N.
Huh.
All right, second rune. What if we, any guesses here?
A Q? No.
Good thinking, but no.
O?
It is an O. So if we remove those descenders, we get the O, and then there it is. And the third rune, which is also a little bit tricky. I have to think outside the box on this one.
A D?
It is a D. So we cut the rune in half, we get the D, right? And then if we look at the other half and we add an ascender, we get the lowercase d. Oh, I lied. There is one more. What could this be? It's straight. It's someone's been guessing it.
A C.
It's a C. Okay.
All
So that's a C. But what if we add a stroke? What do we get? Get a K
Okay.
as well. All right.
Did the Latin alphabet have Ks at this point?
No.
Hmm.
No. Not to my knowledge, anyway.
Hmm.
I wouldn't. Maybe Jock is better to answer that. But K is obviously quite popular in Germanic languages. All right. So other runic characters that are not based on the Latin. So here are some of the other more common, frequently used runic characters in runic writing and engraving, which do not map on to the Latin equivalents. And there are specific reasons why these letters and consonant clusters have these unique characters. For example, the Latin letter P was rather foreign to early Germanic languages. And since the Win rune looks so much like the Latin letter P, the P rune gets its own character. And then in the case of the G rune, for example, one of the more commonly attested versions looks like this. And this is, the G rune also is probably a case of incompleteness on some level, especially alternative versions of the rune, which resemble the swastika, which we obviously no longer use in modern reconstructions. But the G, in this case, is identical to the X letter, so that's quite deceiving. But when we see an X in runes, we're looking at a G. All right, so decoding runes in riddles. Now that we hopefully have some sense as to how we might read runes when we encounter them, let's look a little bit at riddles and how runes and riddles overlap. So the use of runes in riddles acts and runic clues acts simultaneously as a clue and a further obfuscation. So for a rune, a sort of a literate rune reader and riddle solver, the appearance of a runic letter is a welcome sign because you can then leverage that. You can read that rune. And sometimes, in fact, there are solutions encoded in runes. On the other hand, of course, if you can't read the runes, then there's a further layer of obfuscation that is presented. So, runic solution in Exeter book, Riddle 24. One of the clearest examples of how runic clues function in Old English riddles can be found in Riddle 24, which encodes its solution in runes. And so there we have the riddle. I am a wondrous thing. I change my voice. Sometimes I bark like a hound. Sometimes I bleat like a goat. Sometimes I squawk like a goose. Sometimes I screech like a hawk. Sometimes I imitate a gray eagle, the sound of birds of prey. Sometimes I utter with my mouth the kite's voice. Sometimes the gull's song, where I gladly sit. G names me, also A and R. O supports me, H and I. Now I am called as those 6 letters clearly show. So when we look at the 6 runes included in the riddle and rearrange that, well, when we look at the 6 runes, this is what we get. Anyone want to tell me what those runes are? I guess I've already given it away somewhat, but what's the first rune?
G.
G. And then the second one is? Is actually an A. If I should have included that one. This is a good one. If you extend the line down, if you look, if you on the right side, if you were to draw an extra stroke, you would have an A. So that one looks like an F, but it's an A. Then we get the R.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get, actually, that next one that looks like an F is an O. It happens to be an O in this case. This is back to runacy. Then we have our H that we expect, and we have our I. So if we rearrange them, we get this. And we end up with the riddle's solution, which is Higora, or magpie. So here you can see how these runes are being used in the riddle. Brings us to another riddle with runes. This is Exeter book Riddle 19. So runic clues also feature in this riddle, which reads, I saw on a journey, and then we get a collection of runes. Proud in spirit, head bright, running very swiftly over the fruitful plain. It had battle glory on its back, another collection of runes. A nailed road, and then another collection of runes. Traveled the far paths, run strong on the road, brave, and then the final group of runes. The journey was brighter, the very expedition, say what I am called. So the first thing we do is, of course, we look at those runic clusters. And what do those runic clusters, what do they show? They show us letters, right? So the first cluster is SROH. The second is NOM. The third is AGEW. And the fourth is COFOCH. So, and actually, what's interesting about that particular, the final one, where you have the first C rune, it looks much more like a K. If you drew another line, you would get a K, but it's actually a C rune in that case. So, all these words are actually Old English words spelled backwards. So we have the riddle, and then we have the rune clusters in the middle of the various semantic units. And those rune clusters are Old English words in reverse, written in runes. So what we end up with is, I saw on a journey, horse, proud in spirit, head bright, running very swiftly over the fruitful plain. It had battle glory on its back, man, a nailed road, way, traveled the far paths, run strong on the road, brave hawk. The journey was brighter. That very expedition, say what I am called. So, and does anyone have any guess as to what the solution to this riddle might be? We know what the runes say. We know how the runes act as clues in the riddle, but that doesn't get us to the solution. Is there anyone who has a thought about this one?
The sky.
That is very interesting, Jacques. I like that. Full disclosure, right? I'll just be honest right here. Your guess is as good as mine. This riddle is considered unsolved by scholars, so there's plenty of opportunity here for ambitious riddle solvers. I like sky. I hadn't thought about that. Any other ideas?
The sun.
Could be the sun. I definitely think the nailed road is interesting because it's seems like it's a reference to maybe a Roman road, and because that's a way that Old English poems will describe Roman roads. And then the hawk is also pretty specific. I really like the idea of something that's looking down, obviously from above. My thinking was that these were perhaps some kind of specific mythological references, someone who has a hawk and rides a horse, but on the other hand, maybe I'm wrong about that. Obviously, as I said, we don't know the solution, so it's still a bit up in the air. All right, so now I will move on to a discussion of schoolroom riddles and how riddles function in the sort of early medieval classroom. Jacques alluded to the fact that this was part of my dissertation work. So in early medieval England, riddles and enigmata in particular were classroom texts, and they usually represented the lessons that followed grammatical training and just before exegesis. So basically, the second lesson, you have grammar, then you have riddles, sort of, and then you have exegesis or interpreting biblical literature and scripture. So this tradition was started by Aldhelm, who is a early medieval English scholar, who included his enigmata in his curriculum text, which is called the Epistola ad Chiricum, which is widely regarded as the first curriculum text in Anglo-Saxon England and associated with grammatical and elementary education there. Later, Anglo-Latin grammarians followed suit. So both Tatwin and Boniface, which are two other Anglo-Saxon authors, include a collection of riddles as appendices to their grammatical treatises. And so in all three of these cases, their respective enigmata circulated with their Anglo-Latin grammars and educational texts. And the manuscript evidence reveals that these riddle collections were highly glossed, well studied during the period. Because riddles are verbal puzzles and generally center on a single word solution, etymology or perceived etymology is crucial, as is the sense of wonder that they can inspire through their rhetorical games. And there are a number of classroom riddles whose solutions consist of scriptorium utensils of various sorts, stylus, the desk, the manuscript, so on, the codex. And now we will look at a riddle which has a contested solution, and we will talk about the different options. So this is Exeter Riddle 57. All right, so these bear me up, or this bears me up, over little things, over the hill slopes. They are dark-coated, very black, and swarthy, bountiful of song, faring in flocks, chirping loudly, treading the wooded narrows, and sometimes the homestead of children of men. They name themselves. So what are possible solutions to this? Do we have any guesses? and it should be these, not this. That's my bad on the translation there. All right. Well, does anyone have a guess or like inclination as to the type of thing we're talking about?
Starlings?
Starlings is definitely a good guess. What makes you think it's a starling?
Well, the very black, swarthy, bountiful of song, flocks, chirping loudly.
Yep. And okay, very good. So pretty much birds, right? It's a bird riddle. Most people think it's a bird riddle. Okay. So the solutions have been things like crows, which name themselves, right? They crow, and so they name themselves. Their name is what they do. And this is so a similar solution, swallows, has also been proposed for basically the same reasons. And another scholar has proposed flies. I'm a little less inclined in that direction, because as we've said, yeah, there's lots of imagery of flying and all of this, which could be flies, but the flocks, and there's a number of other kind of specifically bird language that makes us think we're dealing with birds.
What about grackles?
I don't even know what grackles are. What are grackles?
Bigger than a starling and smaller than a crow. They're obnoxious birds.
Pretty singularly obnoxious, yeah.
Well, if they're obnoxious in England, then I think it's definitely a possibility for this riddle. But one of the things that's different about this bird riddle, if we're going to agree it's a bird riddle, and most of the other bird riddles are generally in bird riddles, you get some very, very specific reference. So you have the generic bird imagery, but then you also have a reference to a specific thing that is, or attribute that is related to, that bird in particular, and often it comes from a learned source. We don't have that here, right? One of the reasons we have a number of options is because it's a more generic bird riddle. It's the most generic bird riddle, again, if we're going to call it a bird riddle.
What about crickets or grasshoppers?
Absolutely. Yep, crickets or grasshoppers would definitely be, I think, another possibility. That is a good thought. I hadn't thought of that one. The solution I'm partial to is actually runestafas, or letters. Okay. So Patrick Murphy is the scholar who's most recently argued that this is actually a classroom riddle and solved runestafas, and that the dark marks, the dark birds rather, are the marks of a stylus. Flocking together are the letters which make up the words, and of course letters name themselves. Earlier we saw the runes, right? These runes name me. So the language of naming is associated with letters in the Old English tradition, and this is broader than just the riddles. This is true throughout the corpus. So I thought this was a particularly, I think, plausible argument because of the fact that it's rather generic. There aren't those specifics that you expect from the bird riddles, and because one of the rhetorical strategies that we'll talk about later, imitation, basically relies on a riddle that pretends to be something that it's not, that uses language from another genre, or otherwise borrows language to disguise itself. And so Murphy suggests that this is actually what's going on here. And so in making this argument, Murphy ends up actually connecting bird riddles and writing riddles in a folk tradition, in an insular folk tradition, and argues that this is sort of a long-standing tradition, and even suggests that it may provide an answer to Lewis Carroll's famously unsolvable riddle, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" So, Carroll claims that the riddle as originally invented had no answer at all, and but what Murphy suggests is that there is a solution, and it connects to this riddle and the bird riddles and the classroom riddle connection more broadly. Does anyone have any idea what type of solution we might have for this? Why is a raven like a writing desk? I mean, it's a bit of a detour, admittedly. But the answer that Murphy offers is that both have inky quills, both have black feathers, which I thought was interesting and definitely worth thinking about. Okay, so in addition to the importance of grammar and etymology in solving early medieval riddles, riddles also invite figurative thinking, especially considering their use of metaphorical imagery, which we'll talk about. So another famous Anglo-Latin author, Alcuin, displays the pedagogical benefits of riddling in his Disputatio Pipini cum Albino, which is basically a dialogue, a wisdom dialogue that turns into a riddle contest between Alcuin and his student, who is Pippin. And so this is the riddle here. What is a wonder? Pippin asks, right, in this dialogue. And Alcuin responds, recently I saw a person standing, moving, walking, who never was. So what is Alcuin's solution, or what is the riddle that Alcuin is proposing? Can someone walk us through that?
Shadow?
Very close. Very good. It has to do with mirum, the word itself.
Or reflection?
Reflection, exactly. So mirum, which can mean reflection or wonder. Pippin asks, what's a wonder? Alcuin responds with a riddle, which is solution is mirum, but not the sense of mirum that Pippin originally uses. So in this particular dialogue, which is a fascinating text, I really encourage people to read it if you're interested in these types of things, these riddles. Pippin starts by actually being stumped by Alcuin's riddles. Eventually, he ends up learning how to solve them. And actually, by the end of the dialogue, Pippin is actually riddling back to Alcuin, showing that, the student can become the teacher. So, for example, Alcuin has a riddle about a steaming stew, and Pippin responds, our cooks know that one, which is sort of like I got your answer, but I'm not going to display it. So this is, I just want to demonstrate the ways in which the schoolroom and riddles here are intimately related in Anglo-Saxon England and early medieval England. So this brings us to riddling rhetoric in Anglo-Saxon riddles. So in discussing the rich multilingual riddle tradition in early medieval England, I wish to focus specifically on rhetorical strategies employed in riddles as modes of obfuscation. Craig Williams has described Old English riddles as metaphoric and metamorphic, so we'll think about that. And this description also applies, I would argue, to Anglo-Latin Enigmata. Numerous scholars have noted the use of Prosopoeia and the formulaic riddle challenge, which is say what I am called. And then more recently, Patricia Daly has explored how wonder and responsiveness are featured in early medieval English riddles. Mercedes Salvador Bello, another scholar, has noted that sexual riddles appear in both Anglo-Latin and the Old English tradition, and she has argued that Isidore of Seville, and specifically his etymologiae, his etymologies, offers an organizational principle for the Exeter Book riddles, as well as a number of the Anglo-Latin collections. So these are all aspects of the riddle tradition that we're gonna touch on. I would argue that in early medieval riddles from England, and I have argued in my dissertation, that there are four major riddling rhetorical strategies, namely the paradox at the center of most riddles, imitation through the use of metaphor, which we've touched on briefly, equivocation and double entendre, especially in sexual riddles, and esotericism, which is the use of extra-textual information in the riddle, ranging from runic characters, as we've seen, to references to learned knowledge like Isidore's etymologiae. In terms of a multilingual tradition, the Anglo-Latin enigmata, although less frequently studied today, make up a much bigger part of the riddle tradition in early medieval England. Anglo-Latin enigmatists such as Aldhelm, Boniface, Tatwin, Eusebius, Alcuin, and Pseudo-Bede are among some of the more profound authors and riddlers, and the more influential. And then there's the Old English riddles, of course, which occasionally feature in manuscript marginalia, and which has only one significant collection, which is located in the Exeter Book of Old English Poetry. And I can give you the manuscript shelf mark if you're interested. It's Cathedral Library, Exeter Cathedral Library manuscript 3501. All right, so metaphoric. Now we get on to riddle solutions. We're at the point in the talk where basically we're going through to solve these riddles. So metaphoric, that's the clue. This riddle is using metaphor. Exeter Book Riddle 50 uses metaphor to obfuscate, and the riddle says, a warrior is born wondrously on earth, useful to the troop, produced brightly from two mutes. That one enemy wears in injury against his foe. Often a woman wraps him very strong. He heeds them well, obey them agreeably. If kinsmen and kinswomen serve him with right measure. If they feed him fairly, he will raise, it should be their gains, their life in bliss. The grim repay those who let them to become too proud.
What is a child?
Well, I like that because it's something born, but born of two mutes is a little bit of a clue there. And we're dealing with, again, metaphor is the overall clue. Produced brightly is kind of a big, I would say, a big hint. And of course, you have to feed him, and he will grow, which again makes it sound like a child.
Fire.
Fire. Excellent, Jacques.
Fire.
Fire is the solution. And thanks, Chris, for not spoiling it. I appreciate that.
That wasn't me. Somebody else gets credit.
Oh, whoever gets credit for that, I'm sorry. But
Me.
fire is the correct answer. All right, so metamorphic. So now we're looking at riddles that have a large element of transformation as part of their riddling sort of mechanism. So now we've got riddle 12, Exeter Book Riddle 12, which is a metamorphic riddle. And so the solution transforms throughout the course of this riddle. With feet I journey, cutting the ground, the green plains, so long as I am bearing life. Should I lose my spirit, I shall bind fast the swarthy foreigners, sometimes better men. Sometimes I pour out a draught for a brave warrior from my belly. Sometimes a girl treads on me with her very proud feet. Sometimes the dark-haired foreign girl, brought from afar, foolishly drunken, carries me and presses me in the dark night, wets me in water. Sometimes she warms me fairly by the fire. Her wanton hands stick me in my bosom, frequently twisting, sweeping me through the dark. Say what I am called, I who living plunders the land, and after death binds the troop.
Wine.
Wine is good, but it's not exactly the answer, but remember, wine is good because it like transforms. You might say grape, if we're thinking of something that is both a grape and then gets transformed into wine. But it's not grape or wine. All right, I'll give some clues. So we've got when it's alive, it roams on the green plains, but when it loses its spirit, it can bind someone, it can give someone a drink, someone can walk on it, then someone might wet it and heat it again.
What is a fur?
Very close, really close.
Or hide?
A hide. All right, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay.
It is an ox, which of course starts as a living animal, cutting the ground, right? Plunders the land when it's alive. But then when it loses its spirit, it can become a horn for drinking. It can become clothes. It can become fetters. It can become, and then there's the description of the tanning process in terms of the wetting and the warming. Very good. That's excellent. All right, so now we're on to Prosopoeia and the Riddle Challenge. So in Riddle 23, we can see both of these things in action. And I'll read this one to you as well. Wob is my name turned backwards. I am a marvelous thing shaped in combat. When I am bent and a poisonous arrow fares from my bosom, I am all eager, and I swept my mortal blows from afar. Since the wielder who shaped me in torment releases my limbs, I am longer than before, until I spit, blended with destruction, all the venom that I ate before. It is not easily avoided by any human, not any. What I about that? That can't be right. If what flies from my womb touches him, they buy that criminal drink with their might, atonement, fixed and full of his life. I do not at all wish to heed anyone unbound unless skillfully strung. Say what I am called. There's one. So this one's pretty easy, even though there is a typo in my translation. Does anyone have a guess? Maybe someone who doesn't know the answer if you've known it before.
Well, I feel like I'd say bow because the first word is wob turned backwards, but that might be too simple. I don't know.
No, that is correct. And if you look, it's agob, which the manuscript actually says agof. That's we presume that's an error there. But yeah, agob is boa backwards in the Old English. So that's it. Yes, it's a bow, as in a bow and arrow. Pretty straightforward. I mean, a lot of this one is, I think, one of the easier to solve. Okay, wonder and responsiveness. So the emphasis on the wondrous nature of riddle solutions results in their being described often as rattelig, wunderlich, or sellich. And all of these terms basically mean marvelous or wondrous. These words often act as a diversion, right? Characterizing a mundane object as something wondrous. But in other instances, this language refers to specifically mechanical ingenuity and wonder in that context. So, and this next riddle, riddle 32, is along the lines of mechanical ingenuity. So there's a hint. So this Middle Earth is beauteous in manifold ways, adorned with trappings. Marvelous in journeys, I saw this device turn, grinding against the sand, yelling as it fared. This marvelous thing had no sight, nor hands, shoulders, nor arms. The clever machine must sweep on one foot, traveling exceedingly, faring over the fields. It had many ribs, its mouth was in the middle. Useful to mankind, it ferries food wealth, performing public good, inside bearing a banquet. It yields tribute to men each year of that which humans enjoy, powerful and humble. Discern, if you know how, wise and brilliant in words, what this thing might be. Do we have any brave souls with a guess?
The beginning almost makes it sound like a wheel.
Yeah, actually, wheel is a really good guess. It has been proposed. I'm sorry, what?
Millstone?
One more time?
A millstone.
It's not a millstone. At least the accepted answer is not a millstone. I will put out that all the Exeter book riddles that aren't direct translations, their solutions are a bit up for grabs because the manuscript doesn't provide the solutions. So that's why we don't know all the answers. But millstone is not generally the accepted answer for a couple reasons, which we can talk about. But it's a mechanical device that grinds against the sand. It rides on one foot. It's driving. It's moving everywhere, and it has many ribs. Carries a whole banquet with it, and has its mouth in the middle, or a big space in the middle.
Is it a plow?
I like that too. The grinding against the sand, right? That is the big one to focus on. And what is sand usually near? Often.
A boat?
It's a boat.
Boat, yeah.
It's a ship. Absolutely.
What's the 1 foot?
1 foot, I believe.
Keel.
Yeah, exactly. The under the keel, the under the steering apparatus, you know, from underneath, that looks maybe like a foot. That's my sense anyway. That's what I think they're talking about. Okay, so sorry, Jacques.
No, that was me. I was just saying it makes sense, particularly with the ribbing.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so now we're off to paradox. Paradox is, of course, the biggest rhetorical kind of strategy feature within all riddles, really, or most riddles. Indeed, most center on paradoxes, as we'll see when we look at Riddle 47. This one, some of you will probably know, potentially, if you're into Old English. So this riddle is, the moth ate words. That seemed to me a marvelous fate when I asked about that wonder, that the worm, which also could be serpent, a thief in the dark, swallowed the song of one of men, the glorious fast speech and its strong foundation. The stealing guest was not at all wiser, he who swallowed those words.
Bookworm?
Bookworm it is. Very good. All right. And there we have, of course, the paradox of consuming words but not getting any wiser. This is actually a translation of a Symphosius riddle, which is a late classical riddle. All right, so this brings us to another riddle with paradox. We're over here with some Latin enigmata, and specifically this one is Eusebius's Enigma 27. And it reads, though I remain bent, prostrate, or pressed to the low to the ground, from here I will yet exalt all who now possess me. Standing fierce, my adversary is raised up on high, and she lays low or oppresses her own followers. So the paradox here is that the low one raises up their followers, and their enemy, which is high, presses down her followers.
A scale?
It's not a scale, but it's good thinking. And you might it's a theological riddle, so you might be in a good position to solve this. Or those who can read Latin and can see the solution that is on top of the manuscript image.
Pride?
Yes, actually, humility and pride, right? So humility is the low one that exalts its followers, and pride is the high one that oppresses her followers. All right. So then we get to imitation. So Exeter Book Riddle 8 uses metaphor and imitation as modes of obfuscation when describing the riddle subject. So, through my mouth I speak with many voices, I sing in variation. Frequently I mix kindred voices. I cry out aloud, I keep my counsel. I do not conceal my voice. The old evening poet brings bliss to men in cities when I storm the citizens with my voice. They sit still, listening in their homes. Say what I am called, who so clearly proclaims loudly a feasting song, announces to heroes many welcome things with my voice.
Is it a horn?
I like that. Very good idea. Because what we have...
Bell?
I'm sorry, what?
A bell?
A bell, also a great idea. And there is a bell riddle, but it's not this one. We have the repeated reference to voices, and we have the description of this thing as an old evening poet that announces to heroes, right? So what we know is that it has many voices, can vary its voices. It's at night, comes out at night, and, you know, sings these songs.
Nightingale.
Nightingale it is, right? And so the imitation is, of course, the nightingale, the metaphor, it's not actually the evening poet singing to the heroes, but it's serving that sort of same function. All right, equivocation. This is a very famous riddle. Again, some might know it. Exeter book riddle 25 employs equivocation and famously double entendre in its rhetorical designs. So I'll read it. I am a wondrous thing, a help to women, a need of neighbors. I harm none of city dwellers except only my slayer. My foundation is high and steep. I stand on a bed. I am hairy from beneath. Sometimes the very beautiful peasant's daughter, a proud-minded woman, ventures that she grabs onto me, rushes me into redness, plunders my head, holds me in firmness. The curly-haired woman who constrains me fast will feel our meeting. Wet is that eye. So obviously there's double entendre, there's sexual innuendo. I will hint that that is not the solution. So, and again, I think some people will have maybe encountered this riddle, but does anyone who has not encountered it have any guesses besides phallus, which it is not?
Is it a flower with thorns?
It's not, but that's a great guess. I like that idea. That
An
definitely
onion.
the whole furry or hairy beneath.
Is it an onion?
It is. It is an onion. The famous onion riddle. Of course, that makes your eyes wet. Only hurts your slayer, right? Only the person who cuts into it ends up getting the wet eyes and the discomfort. But yeah, we have obviously lots of double entendre going on in this particular riddle. All right, this brings us to the final of the main rhetorical strategies, which is esotericism. So more often than using runic characters, which we've looked at as encoded clues, riddles rely on extra-textual learned sources, as we see here in Riddle 9, which borrows directly from Pliny's Natural Historia, or Historia Naturalis. And I will read this riddle. So, in these days, father and mother gave me up for dead. There was no life yet in me, no spirit within. Then one well-meaning kinsman began to wake me in my garment, held and sheltered me, wrapped me in protective gear, so tenderly as her own child, until I, under her cover, became enlarged in spirit among my non-siblings, as was my destiny. Afterward, that protective kinswoman fed me until I grew up and could make wider journeys. She had fewer of her own sons and daughters because she did so.
So,
any guesses on this one? Now, as I said, this is a riddle that does reach specifically to Pliny. So if you've read Pliny and you know this, then you're better off. But if not,
Could it be the egg of a cuckoo bird?
it absolutely is.
Wow.
How did you figure that?
Nailed.
That's what cuckoos do.
That's what cuckoos do, especially according to Pliny and Isidore, actually. All right. Wow, you guys did really well. I'm quite impressed. So that brings me to a discussion of Anglo-Latin Monster-Enigmas. So monsters are especially prominent fixtures in Anglo-Latin enigmata, perhaps because they are themselves wonders, like monsters are wonders, and thus lend themselves to being riddle subjects. Aldhelm's Enigmata contains 5 monster enigmas. So we'll see those. Eusebius's Enigmata contains also 5 monster enigmas. And Boniface's Enigmata also contain a number of vice riddles which characterize their riddle subjects as monsters or monstrosities. And so you'll see the list here as it shows up. So in Boniface's riddles and in some of the other Anglo-Latin and Old English riddles, the language of monstrosity isn't used to describe a monster, but instead, like the language of wonder, acts as a mode of obfuscation. And also references, Boniface's riddles reference other texts such as Prudentius's Psychomachia and Aldhelm's Carmen de Virginitate. So borrowing images there. And in fact, all the riddlers borrow from Aldhelm. He's really kind of the foundation of Anglo-Saxon riddling. So we'll look at one by Aldhelm, Aldhelm's Enigma 95. So Aldhelm often riddles about classical monstrosities, and this is the case in this particular riddle. So those of you who are familiar with your classical mythology, you will be better suited at solving this riddle, which reads, Look, the fates gave me the name. The fates gave me the name of dogs. Thus does the language of the Greeks render it in words. Ever since the incantations of dread Circe, who stained the waters of the flowing mountains with her words, deceived me. Weaving words, the cruel witch deprived me of thighs, together with shins, and calves, together with knees. Terrified mariners relate that as they impel their ships with oars and cleave the sea, sweeping along the mighty waves, until the tempest rages, where the broad blade of howling offspring that bark about my loins. Thus the daughter Titan, which is Circe, once tricked me, so that I should live as an exile, deservedly, in the salty waves. This is Lapidge's translation here, but so who knows this one? If you know it, you probably know it.
Is this happening live?
Scylla.
It is. It is indeed. She's got to be my favorite monster. All right. This brings us to Boniface. Boniface's Enigma 16, so Boniface's, all of his enigmata are actually acrostic riddles, and they're a testament to his interest in cryptography. And this is the case with this riddle, or Enigma 16, which reads, I'm always well known and was founded upon thirsty mouths, as I allure them more seductively. I am a heroine dear to fools. Continually and savagely I incite wrathful quarrel. I impede sluggish eyes and tongue with impairment, and when the entire body is weakened, I grow less energetic and hand over sleep and seeds of dread to slow feet. The golden wisdom of the favorable will flee afar. The joy of fools leap everywhere with me. Thus luxury also loves me as a sweet mother. I constantly bear nourishment in one bosom as I burn cruel souls with dark flames, so that they cannot scale the lofty heights of star-bearing heaven. While they wander, they seek the depths of the boundless pit of hell. May God remove that serpent from human minds, so that such a monster does not devastate humans throughout ages. Also a theological riddle.
Drunkenness, it says
Drunkenness.
on the acrostic.
Yep, Ebrietas says, right? So that is the solution. Okay, now this brings us to Eusebius 42. Another Anglo-Latin riddler, like Aldhelm, composes monster riddles. So we have this one here. I dreadfully lie hid in dread recesses of a cave, roused to flight. I will mingle with the upper air. When crested, I fly. Fair heaven will be shaken. I am a serpent surpassing in size the crowd of vipers or monsters that bear enormous weight. This savage beast is fed through a tiny mouth and through narrow veins. Its inner parts receive their airy breath. Nor does any brute strength reside in my teeth, but my tail contains violent force. This one comes from Isidore. A lot of this information comes from Isidore of Seville. And the solution is? Does anyone have a guess?
A cyclone?
Good guess. It is a monster.
Hmm.
It's an actual monster.
Isidore of Burlington read the rubric and thinks it's a dragon.
It is a dragon. Yeah, the rubric kind of does, the rubric does help, doesn't it?
Yeah. That's kind of, why do they put the that just seems goofy to give it away right at the start.
Yeah, it's pretty common in most of the extant like collections of the Latin enigmata that they have these up here, and it's thought that they're that the sort of instructor, the teacher, would have the solution, but maybe the students wouldn't. And there are some instances where the solutions are not attached, so it's hard to know exactly how these were used. But it is a good point. It does seem a little counterintuitive to have the solution right off the bat. I think the other thing is that with the Latin riddles, especially since etymology is so important and all of that, and specifically with regard to Isidore, knowing the solution helps you actually understand the riddle, if you know what I'm saying. So the relationship between the solution and the riddle is sometimes a little different than we might expect. But great guess there, even though, it's given away. So the language of monstrosity in Anglo-Saxon riddles, we've been talking about that. And so this one is a translation of Symphosius. I'm not going to belabor it too much. But what we have here is, so there came a creature going to where men were sitting, many in their speech, wise in mind. He had 1 eye and 2 ears and 2 feet and 1,200 heads, 1 back and 1 belly and 2 arms, hands, arms, and shoulders, 1 neck and 2 sides. Say what I am called. So you can see here what we have is basically a list of appendages and features, and they're not what you would expect, which creates the image of sort of a monster, right? We see a monster with 1,200 heads and 1 big belly and whatever. But most of this is actually maps on to a normal human, with the exception of the 1 eye and the 1,200 heads. So the solution is actually a 1-eyed garlic seller. And in case, in this case, without knowing the Symphosius riddle, the late classical riddle, the solution would be virtually impossible to access, right? So this is an example, sort of a prime example of the use of esotericism within the Old English riddles. But also both the Old English translation and the Latin original really use the language of monstrosity to obfuscate their solution and make something that's more mundane seem monstrous. All right, so this brings us to we are almost at the end. This is the second to last riddle we're going to work through, and it's the last Old English riddle. So here we go. I am valuable to men, widely found, brought from the groves and from the city heights, from the valleys and the hills. In day, wagons skillfully carried me, winged in flight, under the roof's protection. After the heroes bathed me in a tub. Now I am the binder and the swinger. Soon I cast the youth to the ground, sometimes the old churl. He who struggles against my spirit and dares grapple with my mighty grip will soon find that he shall seek the ground if he does not before halt his stupidity, strength stolen and strong in speech. I take his might, he has not control of his mind, feet, or hands. Ask what I am called, who by the light of day on earth so binds youth with stupidity after the flood. This one's a bit tricky, but you can get this. So it's something that, comes from the groves, the valleys, the hills, sometimes from the
grape.
Is it a grape? Ooh, that's a great guess. I had another person actually that I showed this riddle to guess that as well. It's not. But it's so close. Very close.
Honey?
Honey is close. Bee is close. But what do you make with honey? Mead, right? And that brings it all together. So it's the mead that's able to throw the youth to the ground and the old man to the ground to overcome the mind, right? And the hands and all of that. But reference to the wings and to coming from the countryside and then being bathed in the tub. That's all the process of turning, from bee to honey to mead. And so now we're on our final riddle. It is a Latin enigma by Aldhelm. So although Aldhelm follows Symphosius's model and composes numerous enigmata about monsters, specifically with monsters as the riddle subjects, he also borrows the late classical enigmatists' use of the language of monstrosity, as we saw with the one-eyed garlic seller riddle, as a mode of obfuscation. And we see that a bit in this riddle, which is his Enigma 97, which reads, again, this is Lapidge's translation, flowering earth bore me back, black from her body, and I produce nothing fecund from my sterile womb. Even though the poets, telling in their verse of the Eumenides, claim that I gave birth to the face of Tartarus. No substance of certain birth pertains to me, but I embrace the foursquare world in my darkness. The Titanian torch of Phoebus, the sun, who is a friend to all as it proceeds through the world, is inimical to me. Grim thieves whom I strive to protect in my dark bosom are always accustomed to love me. Virgil sang this of my dear sister, Rumor. She walks along the ground and hides her head in the clouds, this mighty and unspeakable monster, on whose body there are so many watchful eyes, marvelous to tell, so many tongues, so many mouths, and so many ears. By night she flies in the shadows, midway between heaven and earth. It's something dark, inimical to the sun, protects thieves, and could be described as a monster that walks with its head in the clouds, and with many eyes, many tongues, many mouths, and many ears. Just like Rumor.
A lie?
Wait, I heard two at the same time, but I didn't make out either.
Mine was a lie.
A lie. It's not a lie. Good thinking, though, which is very close to Rumor, obviously. Any other guesses?
They gave it away again.
They give it away every time. I was wondering if anyone was going to go there. So now that we know de nocte, right? The solution is night, which of course covers all these animals. And so the many heads and eyes and mouths and all that are actually the animals under the cover of night.
See, I was going to say night, but then at the very end, it says by night she flies in shadows. So I figured like that eliminated night.
Yeah. Nope. Sometimes it's those clues are really like right there and very obvious, but you never know what's a false sign and what is an actual sort of more straightforward clue because of all the various different modes of obfuscation that go on in these riddles. So we've come to the end of my instruction. I offer here just a selected bibliography of scholarship on riddles, which I'm happy to share with the group if there's interest. I really, really appreciate everyone's attendance, attention, participation as together we puzzled through these medieval riddles. So I want to thank again UVM, Jacques, for this opportunity to present here. And I want to wish everyone, obviously, health and safety as we go forward in these difficult times. So if there's interest, I'm happy to answer questions or have informal discussion for a short bit. and otherwise, I'll just hand it back to Jack.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich.
Try to stop sharing.
So I'm not going anywhere. Rich seems to be, comfortable. Does anybody have questions? So I guess I'm wondering, it seems like there's the Latin and the Old English tradition. Do these connect to other traditions in some way?
Definitely. And how they connect is sometimes tricky to piece out exactly. But Symphosius, who I mentioned briefly, is a late classical riddler who basically establishes the tradition in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. There are a number of copies of his Enigmata, and we know they were the foundation for Aldhelm's own century. So both Symphosius wrote 100, and then Aldhelm followed and also wrote 100. Symphosius's are much more playful. You could say mundane. Aldhelm is much more spiritually oriented, Christian, of course. And so his are very different, but definitely also borrow dramatically from Symphosius's model. His are longer, and their subject matter is often different, but sometimes similar. And then from there, there are a number of anonymous riddle collections, and it's really hard to tell in some cases, especially with this group of riddles called the Burn Riddles, whether or not they are pre-Anglo-Saxon, so like later than Symphosius, but connected to him, and therefore that's why they look kind of similar to the Anglo-Saxon riddles too, or they might actually be Carolingian, and on the other end of the riddle tradition, sort of coming out of the Anglo-Saxon period, and actually that's what I tend to be more persuaded of that. But for a long time they were considered Italian, and now it's unclear. And this was believed because the subjects were like palm tree and all this sort of stuff. But we know Anglo-Saxons wrote riddles about all kinds of things that were many things that were foreign, and that were only known through books. And so whether the Burn Riddles are actually Italian or they're Anglo-Saxon or maybe they're Carolingian, because the Carolingians import during Charlemagne's time basically all the Anglo-Saxon curriculum, which included all these riddles. So after that point, the riddling tradition, especially in the pedagogical sense, impacts the continent. And actually, Alcuin, who offers that dialogue with Pippin is Charlemagne's son. So Alcuin is in fact an Anglo-Saxon riddler taken from England and brought to the continent to serve Charlemagne and bring basically the knowledge to his court. So absolutely, the Anglo-Saxon riddle tradition kind of marks the pinnacle, I would argue, of medieval riddling, and it was definitely kind of it had its heyday. The most serious authors were writing riddles at this particular time, and riddles were regarded as sort of the intro to start looking at words in a sort of metaphysical way that would lead into naturally interpreting the Bible. So yeah, it's I mean, obviously I love it, or I wouldn't have spent so much time looking at these things. But it's definitely a deep tradition that's connected.
This goes all the way back to the beginning of the talk, but I was wondering if you know anything about the relation on the topic of the relationship of the runes to the Latin letters. Some of them it's easy to understand the transformations, but I guess I'm confused by the ones that are flipped upside down or even sideways. It seems like a really radical transformation. Maybe it's not actually of a totally different sort than anything else. And that's obviously far away from kind of the meat of this talk, but I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a great question. So the reason why runes aren't uniform and don't have the same orientation as always as some of the Latin characters is that runes were carved on objects really to begin with, and so there wasn't like a correct way really to do that. So, you know, when the Germanic tribal people were first encountering the Latin scripts, they were also encountering it as engravings generally on graves and on goods. And so it was really easy to just like flip it upside down and see a different orientation. It wasn't like they were looking at manuscripts which had all, you know, the sort of standard orientations that we expect and lots of examples of that. It's more likely they had some artifact that had a few, like, you know, a Latin inscription on it that was rather short. And they looked at it and used that as the model. And so yes, sometimes we have alternative orientations that come to be more or less standard. But even still, you'll find runes that are flipped the correct way. You know, I mean, part of the problem with runes is the wild lack of standardization.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yes, that's really interesting that the orientation of the objects they were looking at wouldn't have been so clear. Super cool.
Yeah, and this was pre-Christian, of course, too. So it was, you know, in terms of when the Germanic tribes encountered, you know, the script. So, yeah, it's in the inscription days for sure. There's more of that out there that they would be exposed to.
Would this have been before the Germanics would have had their own any kind of written language whatsoever?
Yes.
This was the first. Okay.
Yes. The generally accepted belief, which I also am convinced by, is that the Germanic tribal peoples, of course, they had their language, but they encountered writing when they encountered Rome, and they adapted the Roman alphabet, the Latin alphabet, to meet their needs with regard to their own language.
Do you have a sense of like the century?
Oh, well, I mean, it's highly debatable. I mean, most people think it's around like the 100 CE or whatever, or a little before that, probably a little before that. It's hard to know because we don't have like, oh, this is the first runic artifact, right? I mean, the archaeological record is very incomplete, but we do know that by the 1st and 2nd century we start to see runes. So at least at that point they've developed it enough. So obviously they would have found it out earlier and had to do some organization, you know, not standardization, but some kind of a mutual agreement on what these letters meant before they are going to be showing up.
So, like, if they adapted the Latin alphabet, why did they then reorder it? Or is there any idea?
Reorder it in which way?
That, like, the runes aren't in the same order as the current alphabet.
Oh, you mean like A, B, C, D sort of a thing?
Futhark.
Yeah, Futhark is the first letters of their alphabet, which is why we call it Futhark. Supposedly, the first letter, the F, the U, you know. There isn't really, I mean, it's, again, like, there isn't really an order, I guess I would say, to the alphabet at that point with regard to runes. You know, I think they just looked at characters and tried to map them on and didn't really conceive of it in that same kind of organized sense. Quite frankly, I just think it's less organized.
That's curious though, because when the Phoenician alphabet gets transmitted to Greece and Italy and on to Gaul, it maintains its order. Part of learning it is memorizing it in that specific order. So there's presumably some other, you know, there's some different factor that allowed it to lose its shape.
Well, again, I think it might be that it was, you know, mostly found on objects and inscriptions. It wasn't like when the Latin alphabet was first introduced to the Germanic tribes, it was imported kind of wholesale in the way that you know, it might have been preferable. I'm going back to look at that. Yeah, and again, so most of the time in the Icelandic manuscripts, we start with F, then we have U, then we have thorn. So there is an order. It is different. By the time we get to the Icelandic, though, and this isn't always the case, but this just happens to be the case in this particular manuscript. But I do think it's generally, you know, more often than not. But this isn't until, you know, this manuscript isn't until like the 13th century. So we're talking about a long time after runes are initially conceived of.
So maybe one plausible story could be that, I mean, I don't know if this is still state of the art, but the idea is that some sort of Canaanite Phoenician people decided to use an Egyptian script, and they didn't really have any idea of alphabetical order. They just sort of saw those letters, figured I can use those to talk to my gods, and then I'm going to make up something for my language. And then maybe later on they learned some order. But
Right.
by then they had already come up with their own order. I mean, that's just a possibly plausible story.
Yeah, that's kind of the sense I have. So yeah, I would lean toward that way, but we don't know.
Is there anybody else who has a question?
I have a question. So the schoolroom riddles, what were they trying to teach? Was it just reading and writing, or did they have some like deeper purpose?
Definitely deeper than reading and writing. So you start with grammar, with your typical Latin grammar, and then basically the next lessons would be runes. Not runes, riddles, excuse me. And so what the riddles are looking to teach is how to use words in a way that kind of considers considers the word like almost a physical object, and considers all its parts, whether there's homonyms, whether there's homophones, homographs. So whether there are other words that like look the same but have different meanings, or other senses of a specific word. So all of those things are in play. Figurative thinking is huge, of course, in riddles. So you're starting to not look, the idea is not to see warrior and say, oh, it's got to be a warrior. No, the warrior is fire, right? Metaphorically. So it's, again, not only thinking about kind of the etymology and the metaphysics of a word, but also figurative thinking in terms of metaphorical descriptions. And since part of the goal of exegesis, especially in the early medieval period, was unlocking these secrets that were hidden in scriptures, supposedly, or as was believed, this is, of course, what you're trying to do with a riddle, right? Is like unlock the hidden meaning underneath all these clues. And so I think in that way, it also serves, that sort of utilitarian function for someone who would maybe be going into the clergy. The other thing about riddles tap into a medieval aesthetic, which has to do with wonder. Okay, so if you look at like a medieval painting, right, you'll see that there are like no central focus, right? This is the perspective issue, right, that gets fixed supposedly by the Renaissance. You get a bunch of different images. It's pulling your eye all over the place, and you basically get overwhelmed. That's the idea. Is you get bewildered, you get kind of overwhelmed with the wonder of the art or the architecture or whatever it is, and then after you kind of got your bearings, you start to look at all the little pieces and figure out how the narrative kind of makes sense, or how the bigger picture works together. And that's sort of a breakdown of a type of medieval aesthetic that is operating also in the riddle. You're supposed to first read the riddle, be overwhelmed or confused or bewildered by it, have that sense of wonder, and then in working through the riddle, you basically enlighten yourself, right? You overcome the challenges, the verbal puzzles, and that's supposed to lead to kind of like a sense of understanding. And so that's, I think, kind of part of what's going on also with the riddles, in addition to teaching kind of how to interpret the grammar. For example, there was one riddle where, for example, like all of the vices and virtues are feminine in Latin grammatically. So, so there'll be feminine pronouns used for that. And the same is true with Old English. So you have to know grammar because everything is grammatical gender in both English and Latin. And, things like pronouns and all of this will give you hints as well in terms of what word is actually the riddle solution. So yeah, it's riddles are very much kind of second step and just above elementary, if you want to think of it in that way.
It seems like they're fairly sophisticated in their shape, as you're pointing out with the art, in that they are non-linear texts in a way. Of course, you have to read them linearly, but then you can't just figure them out. That you have to go back and look, and each sentence seems not so connected to the others, and so you could almost change the order of the sentences and it would be fine. That's kind of an interesting aspect of them, that most texts don't share so much, except that we know you have to go back and reread a text, but generally they're more linear.
Absolutely. And even more so, once you get the solution, you go back again and you look at all the clues that you missed. You know, how does the solution fit the clues is almost as important on a pedagogical level as, you know, the other way around. How do all the clues basically result in the solution? So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's nonlinear, and it's designed to make you kind of puzzle and go back multiple times to really unpack all the rhetorical stuff going on.
Is there any connection to the fable tradition? I think fables are a particularly good place where it seems childish and playful, but there's a trickster in there, and there's often a sort of deeper meaning and arguably philosophy and sort of deep thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any sort of direct connection that I can think of in terms of, you know, fables with riddles or something along those lines. But I do think, yeah, what you're talking about in terms of like a deeper meaning to a written work that is actually something of a puzzle, you know, it's much more pronounced in a riddle than in a fable, but it's also in a parable, right? Which is the whole point for riddling is eventually to get back to the Bible. Well, not all riddles, but these Anglo-Saxon riddles. So yeah, I think that the relationship is definitely there. And it's, you know, it's probably there for most good literature, right? It's more than just the story. It's something a little bit deeper, hidden within. That's why I like literature.
It's like a Tolkienian fairy story in many ways. It has that wonder, that deeper meaning.
Definitely, absolutely, yeah. Fairy stories, fables, parables. I think all of those things, you know, it's almost like you could learn runes to then interpret things like that, stories like that, potentially.
And it seems to me riddles are kind of fun way of teaching too, because well, I was just thinking about this. They're kind of risky, or you know, there's something fun about the dynamic of a teacher who's you know, using this in a kind of scholastic way to enlighten the student, because the student could just as easily or possibly enlighten the teacher. Right? I mean, like we do, like, well, oh, but my answer is just as good as yours. You know, if I can actually lay out my argument for why my answer works, which you think in some ways that's the hope of any teacher, right? Is that the student might actually say, look, I've actually come up with a good answer and it works. I can justify it. You know, so it's just a fun, fascinating way of teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alcuin, I think, you know, who's known to be very playful as a teacher, really demonstrates that in his Disputatio, because it's all about, yeah, basically the student becoming the teacher. Once you start to really understand how riddles work, you can outfox the master. And as I mentioned, it becomes a sort of an in-group out, or I guess cognoscenti kind of situation where, you know, Alcuin riddles, Pippin gets it, but the rest of the class doesn't, you know, or whatever. And Pippin shows that he gets it by riddling back, not the solution, but another part of the riddle, you know. And so there are so many ways, I think, that riddles do lend themselves to sort of to having a pedagogical virtue. And part of it is that interactiveness, that responsiveness that riddles have. You know, you're asked a question, you have to work it out and then respond with a solution. So there's also that aspect that you don't get in, say, grammar study.
Nice.
Well, I think we should thank Rich for a wonderful talk and some great stimulation this evening, for coming into all of our homes. And thank you so much, Rich. All applause to you.
Thanks a lot.
As I mentioned, this is recorded, so if you want a recording of it, just let me know. I'll send one out. It's available.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack, again for Jacques again for organizing, and yeah, just this has been awesome. So, you know, I wish I could be there in person at UVM, but this is the next best thing. So it's been a lot of fun.
Pretty good.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch, Rich.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.